We're going to cover a pretty diverse set of topics today, and this session is geared towards those of you who understand the basics and want to really get down into the nitty-gritty and the tips and tricks. So we're going to bounce around a little bit, roughly covering the list you see here. We're going to start with some field creation tools and options. We'll then go through various ways of configuring fields, both layer by layer and then down to the zone level. We'll talk about different types of field activations, and then we'll run some recommendations and talk about ways of taking that up to the next level as well. Then we'll go through the process of exporting recommendations. We'll talk about custom fertilizers and foliar fertilizers. We'll talk about ways of modifying the parameters that go into making a recommendation. And then we'll close up with nitrogen alerts and just touch on the sensitivity of the inputs within AdaptN. And then, of course, you should already be aware of our help site, but if you're not, you can visit www.adaptn.com/help for resources, help articles, and of course, a way of contacting us. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the live tool here. If you've not taken one of our basic webinars, there's a video recording of essentially the same thing right when you first log in, this video that's called AdaptN Basic Training. So if after today's session you feel like you need to brush up on some of the basics, I would recommend you log in and watch that. It's about 25 minutes long, and it goes through the more basic elements of importing growers, farms, fields, and running recommendations. So what we're going to do to start is we're going to talk about different ways of bringing field boundaries into the system. And I'm going to start with just a very basic example where we do it by hand. And we're going to quickly get beyond this and move into bulk imports and integration imports. But essentially, if we click this plus button up at the top next to any growers, fields, and zones list, you're presented with three options. And this is probably something you all know, but just to cover it, if you did want to use a shapefile, all you'd need to do is zip up the 3 or 4 components of that shapefile and then drag it onto the system. So for example, I have a folder here on my computer, and it has 3 components in a shapefile, a DBF, SHP, and SHX file. That's what you're going to get when you export a shapefile out of pretty much any GIS system. There may be other files as well, like a PRJ or some others. That's perfectly fine, but these are the required files. You're going to make them into a zip file. On a Mac, you would simply go to the compress menu. On a PC, there's a slightly different menu option, but the same idea. And then you take that zip file and just drag it right into that drop zone, and it goes off and creates the boundary for you. Now at this point, you get to choose from the field mode, point-based, zone-based, and grid-based. And we're going to talk about these differences in much more detail. For point and zone-based, you also get to choose how you want to create your zones. None would mean you're going to go and draw them later. Single zone would just give you one big zone for the field. By soil type is going to use the NRCS Surgo database to create your soil zones. And this is a new option I'm just going to touch on briefly, as this did not exist last season. It's the ability to create zones from a shapefile. Now, all you would do is click this little box here, and it's going to pull up a dialog box, and you can go find whatever shapefile has the zones you're interested in. And then it will bring up a list of the attributes and also an option to merge zones based on the name in the shapefile. What this means is if you have multiple polygons with the same attribute name, it will consolidate those into single zone sets. And just to show you this example, I'm going to use my yield attribute. And what it's going to show us is I've got now 5 or 6 zones with different yield values, 160, 170, etc. That's the attribute that I had named within my shapefile. So that's how that option works, and that's a fairly manual process, but certainly something you can do pretty easily and slice and dice the field geometry however you want in whatever system you're working with. The next tool I'm going to show you as far as bringing boundaries and data in uses some of our integrations. And I'm just going to summarize our integrations first, and then we'll talk through them. We're going to use today the example of our AgX integration and our Agrian integration. I'm just going to put something up on the screen here to compare and contrast these. There's also the option to use a shapefile for all of these, and you can see that over on the right. And we have some other integrations as well, but those live in other applications. So I'm going to focus on the ones that you might be accessing from within Adaptn. And by the way, if you use these systems and you don't have the integration turned on, just let us know and we'll correct that for you. But as you can see, running down the left, there's a handful of data layers and data types that are supported. And there's a lot of similarity, but some differences between how these integrations work. So the example I'm going to go through in just a second here is for AgX. And you'll see that I'm going to bring in boundaries and zones. I'm going to be able to sync organic matter, soil pH tests, and soon we'll be able to sync soil nitrate values as well. That applies, everything I just said applies to both AgX and Agrian. And then within AgX, I'll show you how you can access both planting recommendations as well as yield data to set yield goals within Adaptn. And then at the end of the process with AgX, you can export a prescription back to SST. With Agrian or our shapefile method, you can download it as a shapefile. On the right, you'll notice it says points or polygons for most of these layers. Last year, we did add support for point-based data files for things like planting rates and yield goals, which allows you to bring in as applied data as opposed to just recommendation data. So basically, you can do that for everything now except zones. We do recommend, whenever possible, using a polygon-based file, perhaps something that you surfaced, because it's a lot less data and it'll be much cleaner, but you really do have the option to use either now. So that's just a quick snapshot. If you have specific questions about those integration differences, just let us know. But I'm going to go into my account settings here, and I'm going to log into my AgX account. And in fact, I think I've already done that with this demo system. If you've not yet authenticated with AgX, you'd click this green button, and it'll take you into this authentication screen. If you're an Agrian user, it's exactly the same process. You would just use your Agrian credentials. Now, as a quick refresher, in order to be able to import fields through any of these integrations, you first need to import the grower using this Growers tab. And I've already imported this grower, which is what I'm going to work with. But if I wanted to import another one, I would just scroll down and choose whichever one I want. Once you've done that, you can go to the Fields menu and choose the grower of interest. And it's going to pull in the fields available for import. And if you see a box that's grayed out, that means it's already in Adaptn. This Fields tab would let me bring in just a single field at a time. And the benefit to that, and I'll show you an example of this, is that if I want to bring in just a single field and I click import, I'm also going to be given the option to use any saved management zones from within that source system to create my zones in Adaptn. And in this case, you can see an AgX zones button show up, and a list of saved management zones becomes available. Same exact process for Agrian. And then you would just select the one you want, and it would go off and create zones in Adaptn that match. The reason that this is only available through the single field import panel in the integration is that the management zones are obviously different field by field. So if you do want to use management zones to create your zones in Adaptn, you would use the single field option. And I'll go ahead and submit that. And you'll see that we're going to end up with some zones in Adaptn that correspond with zones that came from, in this case, SST Summit. And these zones were called high, medium, and low. All right, I'm going to delete that field and import it again using our bulk importer. And by the way, if there are no fields in the grower's account, you'll see this same option, and you're going to be working with the Sync with the Source tool over on the right. If you do have access to both integrations, you're going to see this choice. I'm going to go with AgX, and then it's going to take me right back where I was, and it's going to default to that same grower. But you'll notice that in this Fields tab, I can only check one at a time. So I'm going to move over to this next tab called Bulk Import, and I'm going to choose the same grower. There is an option to show all farms and fields. If you want to import multiple growers at a time, you certainly can. And there's our same list. And at this point, we are going to select multiple. And one of the things we're going to do is look down at the configuration parameters down below. And what you'll see is a set of configuration parameters that allow you to essentially configure the entirety of the fields in the process of importing them. So what this would allow you to do is set up the field start to finish so that all you have to do when you're done importing is come back and make any minor adjustments that you see fit. So as you can see, I'm just walking my way down and setting really the sort of grower standard practices for these fields, like our planting date that we expect, our tillage system. I can choose to put in an organic matter value if I want. This would be an average, and then it's going to ask me for my sample depth. And once we pull the field into the system, we're going to just need to go and make whatever minor tweaks we want, and then we'll be able to run our recommendation. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the import button now. And what you'll see here is the system is going to run down and start importing fields and layers of data. And now it's complete. So what I'm going to do here is click OK. I'm going to go find that grower's fields in the system. And it has now imported all three of these fields. And you can see all the zones created. And if I go into the Configure Field tool, we can see over on the right here that these layers are now already configured at 100%. And you can see the timestamp of when it was updated. And if I want to go into any one of these layers, I can see what the current data shows. And you'll see the map at the top, update, in this case, soil type, slope, organic matter, etc. Now you'll notice in this case, the organic matter values are already set, and the reason that they are set with spatial variability and not through that default that I set is because there was OM data on file for this field, and we automatically made use of that most recent soil sample. The rest of these values, for example, my tillage method, where I've got no-till up here, that's because that's what I set in the bulk importer. In this field's case, if I scroll down to our soil pH layer, that data is set as well. So at this point, I'm basically good to go. I can just activate this field and run it. The one thing I want to touch on, though, is the fact that we can further fine-tune things like our expected yield or our harvest population values, which are potentially set to a flat value. In this case, we have 170. That's the default I set. But maybe I have a CEI recommendation or a management zone yield goal that I want to take advantage of. So I'm going into the sync with a source option, and I'm going to press this submit button. And it's going to pop up a dialog box that shows me any available AgX data to set the layer in question. And in this case, I have two saved management zone sets with differing yield goals. I can choose the one I want and hit submit. And it's going to go off and grab that data. And now we have a variable yield layer as well. While we're on this screen, I want to show you this default option. This exists on a number of layers, and you'll notice that I didn't set it in this case. And if I pull open the menu, it's got all the same yield options you'd normally see. When you're running a sync with a source or using a shapefile to upload spatial data, the default option only comes into play if the source data you're using is missing geometry against the field's boundary. So as an example, if the AgX management zones did not cover the entire field, then the default would get used. Or similarly, if a shapefile did not cover the whole field, then the default value would get used. However, if in this case it did cover the whole field, this is not needed and I can just leave it blank. So that's what that option is. If you're always filling it out and you feel like you don't need to, you can try not filling it out and see what happens. So that is an example of the bulk import process and a way of tweaking the field to further refine it. And I could do the same thing with expected harvest population. I'm not sure if I even have data for this field, but I'm going to run it and see. If so, it's going to go and show me what the available data from AgX is. And it does look like I have, in this case, a CEI recommendation. At this point, all I need to do is click the Activate Field button up at the top here, or if I go back to the Fields and Zones list and click Activate, then I'll be presented with my activation options. As a quick review, there's two different types of activations available. We have our regular Activate Field, which is a billable event and something that lets you run your normal in-season recommendations. We also introduced at the end of last season our training mode concept, which lets you run the field at no charge, but using only prior season's weather data. And that's useful both for learning the system and also for demonstrating the power of the variable rate recommendation to your grower. So for example, if I click this date box up at the top, I can go back and choose a rec as of June 1st of 2016, for example, and run it. Quick power user tip, if you are sitting on a recommendation screen and you see this red bar at the top, it is going to auto refresh every 30 seconds, and most recommendations will complete generally within a minute, if not sooner. If you're running a recommendation with thousands of zones, it's going to take a little bit longer. But you can just leave this and it will keep running. You don't have to stay on the screen. However, it's going to keep running even if you leave. So for example, by the way, it's about to refresh. I can see the little spinner up at the top here, and this one is done now. I could have left the screen if I wanted though, and it would keep running. And this little one up at the top tells us that we have a message in our notifications window. If we click the logo up here, we can see whatever was completed since we last visited this page shows up in bold. And in this case, it's my training mode field for June 1st. And I can just click on the link and it'll take me right back to that field. Now, while we're on this page, I'm going to show you how we might look at different weather data to see how it might impact a recommendation. So I'm going to run the same recommendation for a different year, for example, June 1st of 2012. And we'll just see how these compare. Now, I haven't actually added any nitrogen yet, so we're not looking at, sort of the completely realistic scenario. I'm going to go back and do that before we run it for this season. But this would be a way of potentially showing your grower how, mineralization values and losses from mineralization would differ under different weather conditions. So again, if I click this link up at the top here, we can see that this one is just getting started. This page also auto refreshes now and will sort of notify you when things complete. So I'm going to open up our two recommendations side by side. And this is our 2016 recommendation, 16,000 pounds of nitrogen needed in total. And here's our 2012 recommendation, 14,000 and change. So that is one way you can use training mode to work with a grower to help them understand how the weather might have a different impact on their total nitrogen needs. Now, if you want to take that a step further and understand what's actually different about these recommendations, you can dive into the details of any zone by simply clicking on it. You can zoom in if you want. You can click on it on the map, and you can click the View Details link. And I'm going to do the same thing for both recommendations. So here's our June 1st, 2016 recommendation, calling for 225 pounds of nitrogen. Here's our June 1st, 2012, calling for 205. Now, the thing that jumps out at me the most is the difference in rainfall. 2.2 inches since planting versus 3.6. Not a huge difference, but within the span of only a couple weeks, it's somewhat significant. You can also jump into the graphs here and actually look at these events over time. For example, total precipitation and N loss, and each of these spikes are our precipitation events. So as you're working to understand a recommendation, you can dive into the details with your grower if you'd like, or in advance of a meeting with the grower, and really understand where these recommendations are coming from. Now, while we're on this screen, I want to call your attention to this value here. And it says that this recommendation uses these modified parameters, and it's got dollars per bushel, pounds of N per expected bushel, and then dollars per pound of nitrogen. And you're going to see that same thing on the field recommendation as well, right here. This is what we call a modified recommendation parameter. And if we go to our settings and you go to the user and grower list, and by the way, accounts have different permission options, so it's possible that you may not see exactly this list, but somebody in your organization has permissions for this. There's a little $ icon next to each grower that says modify recommendation parameters. And if you go into that, this is where you are able to set these modified parameters, and you can see exactly what I just showed there. And this is the number that I had changed. Our default is close to 1, and I had set that to 1.2. So if I remove these values, and I go back into that same page, you can now see the defaults. You'll notice that with this 225 pound recommendation, if I just run that again for the same date, June 1st, 2016, you're going to see that number change. Before I rerun this, I want to call your attention to the yield goal on this zone, which is set at 210. And our expected nitrogen in the crop at harvest time is 242. And this is under our 1.2 pounds of N per bushel of yield. I'm going to rerun this now, and we're going to expect that number to change because we've changed our expected pounds of N per bushel of yield. So our yield goal is still 210, but now our expected nitrogen in the crop at harvest time has dropped from 242 down to 215. So that's how the modified recommendation parameters work. And again, that's something that administrators can change, but most users can see. So if there's something that you'd like changed, you should talk to your administrator if you don't have access to do it yourself. There's also the option to do this system-wide. So I was clicking on the $ next to any grower, which changes it just for that grower's field. But up at the top of your user list, you can actually set this for your entire account. And the hierarchy is that when we run a recommendation, we first check to see if the grower has modified recommendation parameters set, and if so, we use them. Then we check and see if your account setting is set across the whole account. If so, we use that. And if not, then we use AdaptN's defaults, which you can see listed right here. And we do change these from season to season based on national averages. So that is the modified recommendation parameters component. Now, if I were to try and export this recommendation right now, I'll have the option to work through my recommendation export screen, but you'll notice that the export button at the bottom is disabled. And the reason for that is that training mode fields can't be exported. And that's, of course, because it wouldn't make any sense to use a prior year's recommendation for the current season because the weather data is completely different. So that's why it's disabled. But all you need to do is activate the field, and then you'd be given the opportunity to run that export. Before we do that, though, I'm going to go back to my fields and zones view for this grower. And I'm going to switch this field into a different mode real quick. And there's a couple ways of doing that. While a field is inactive, such as this other field up here that we haven't really touched yet, you can go to the field menu and click delete. Now it's gone. You can also do that with the training mode field, or any field, whether it's inactive in training mode or activated. You can use this change field mode tool. And I'm going to show you that right now. We've updated this recently, so it now has all the same options as the create field tool. And it's going to show me that my current field mode is zones, and now I can choose my new mode. And you'll see that it has all the same options. So if we wanted to change our zones, for example, instead of using AgX zones, we wanted to use a shapefile, we could indicate that here. Or maybe we want to choose a different set of management zones from AgX. But in my case, I'm going to actually switch this to a grid-based field and just show you how things differ a little bit between the zone and grid-based approach. So I'm going to leave the existing field as is. If I use this checkbox, that would delete it, but I'm going to leave it around so we have these two fields side by side. Now, anytime you change the field mode, you are going to need to reconfigure the data layers. And the reason for that is because the geometry is fundamentally different. The zones are spatially different from how they were before. So you can still have the benefit of all the integration options, but anything you might have changed for that first field is not going to apply to the second field other than its boundary. With a grid-based field, and you'll notice this is the one I just created, you're always going to use the configure field tool. And to contrast that, I'm going to show you a couple other zone editing options in a minute for our first field. But I'm going to go into this configure field tool and show you that the main difference between a grid and a zone-based field is that the layers for the geometry for each layer can be different on a grid-based field, whereas it can't for a zone-based field. So you'll notice that on my soil organic matter layer, there are actually more OM values on this grid-based field than we had seen on our zone-based field. And I'm going to pull that up side by side just to show you the difference real quick. So we have a different set of OM values that go into the field, but when we run our recommendation, and if I go into any one of these zones, each OM value, or I should say each zone gets a single OM value with a zone-based field. And to show you exactly what I mean by that, I'm going to open up an individual zone and pull up the soil option. And we can see that this entire area in red has the same OM value of 2%. If I click on another zone, this entire area in red has an OM value of 2.8. When we're looking at our grid-based field, though, we abide exactly by what the source data looks like because we're actually doing this down at the 60 by 60 foot level. And when we run our recommendation, we're going to see how that plays out because we can have much more granularity amongst our zones. Same thing would happen for things like expected harvest population. I'm going to go ahead and sync this down to AgX. And we'll see what our options are here. When we go off and we run our data for things like expected yield, expected harvest population, any nitrogen that we apply, and I can go ahead and add some if I want, we're going to have the ability to really fine-tune this. And that's the primary difference between a zone and a grid-based field, is how the geometry plays out in terms of variability. So what I'm going to do now is switch gears slightly and go back to our export tool, which, as you recall, is currently disabled. So I'm going to turn that on by clicking activate. And now you'll notice I have only a single option. This is because we've already done the training mode bit, and now we're going into live mode. Now the field is active. I'll go back to my recommendation. And you'll notice this red bar up at the top, which says this recommendation is more than 1 day old. So that's basically warning us that we're looking at an old recommendation or recommendation for a prior date. So we don't want to use that. So I'm kicking off a new recommendation. And once this completes, this is going to make use of all the weather data up until this morning. And that's, of course, what we want to use for the current season. Once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and click the export button and talk through custom fertilizers, modifying the recommendation, and foliar fertilizer products. So here's our recommendation for today. I'm going to click export, and I'm going to walk you through this screen real quick. So first of all, export type. You're only going to see this option when the field is connected to another system that supports us sending recommendations back. So in this case, we have the AgX option. If you had created the field manually with a shapefile or by drawing it on a map or from a system that doesn't support us sending recs back, you just won't see this box. So if I click AgX, it's going to send this back in the form of a crop establishment and input recommendation. If I click shapefile, it's going to let you download it here. You can change the name of the shapefile if you want. You could call it side dress, for example. And then you get to choose your nitrogen product. Up at the top, the first 12 or so products are standard, and those are available to everyone, both liquid and solid products. So if we wanted, for example, just a 28% recommendation, you can simply select that. If you want to blend rates or blend different products, you would lower this percentage, and then you have an option to choose a second product. And then finally, if you want to round that recommendation down to the units of that product, in this case gallons, you can do so using this option. At the bottom of this list, you'll notice that there's something called a custom blend. That is basically a fertilizer that the user has set up, in this case in the AgX system, that has been made available for use by Adapten. If you go into your settings, and I'm just going to open this in a new tab here, and if you click AgX settings, there is a tab called custom fertilizers. And this shows you all the fertilizers that were set up within AgX, the NPK makeup, whether it's a liquid or a solid, and then there's a box that lets you check to say whether you want it to show up within Adapten or not. And of course, if you have a very long list of these, you may not want them all showing up, and that's why you have that option. So you'll notice that some of the ones that I have checked, for example, ESN with AMS with sulfur is checked, and that's going to show up on my list right here. Now the one below it I want to touch on in particular, SRN25B, I had set up in my AgX account. This is a foliar product, and we do support conversion of regular ground applied nitrogen into foliar applied nitrogen. And that's something that we can do for you upon request. You'll notice that this says foliar X4. That basically means that the user has provided a 4-to-1 conversion factor between how much or how many pounds of ground applied nitrogen get replaced by a pound of foliar applied nitrogen. So in this case, you would have 4 ground applied nitrogen pounds versus 1 pound of the foliar product. So if you would like those to be set up, all you need to do is send us the NPK and specific gravity of the product, or just send us the product label, and we will get that set up for you, and then you have the option to choose that from within your export tool. No matter what you choose, whether it's a standard product, a custom blend, or a foliar product, we are going to do the conversion for you, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. Before we do the export, though, I want to make some modifications. So to explain what these do, if you put a minimum on your rate modification, it's going to raise any value that falls below the minimum to whatever that new minimum is. So right now, my minimum is 160. If I put a minimum of 170 on, for example, it has now adjusted my entire recommendation, changing all the minimums accordingly. If you click this Adjust Individual Rates option down below, you can see the individual values that have gotten changed. So in this case, I had a 160 rate that got bumped up to 170. I had a small section of the field with no recommendation that got bumped up to 170. I can do the same thing with a maximum. We currently have a max of 230. Maybe I want to drop that to 220. And we can see this one changed. The blue means we lowered it. The red means we raised it. And then I can make adjustments by percentage or pounds of nitrogen if I want. So I could raise everything by 5. You'll notice the 220 did not change because of that maximum. And I hit the export recommendation button. It's going to save this zip file for me right onto your computer, wherever you save files. And within this folder is going to be that same set of shapefile documents as well as a PDF. And if you haven't seen what this looks like, this is a load sheet that essentially tells you exactly how many units of product you need to fulfill the recommendation based on whatever modifications you've made. So in this case, it's our foliar product, so it's in gallons, and we made some changes and we need 1,394 gallons total. If we open up the shapefile itself, and this will load up in whatever GIS program you're normally using. Let me slide this over here. It's going to have the geometry, of course. And if you open up the rate table, you're always going to have a column called Z100, which is the pure nitrogen recommendation. That corresponds with what AdaptN shows you in our field recommendation. And then for whatever product or products you've selected, it's going to show you a column that says Z and then the NPK rates and then the units of that same product. And any rounding that you've put in is going to apply there as well. If I did blend products on that export screen, you'd see another set here. So that's what the shapefile looks like. If this were sent back to AgX in this case, this is going to show up as a CEI recommendation within Summit. And just to show those of you that are using that system what that looks like, this is a CEI recommendation within Summit. And you'll see in this section over on the left here, the fertilizer that was used, the rate, and the units. This is a different field, but the same concept. And if you have specific questions or issues with that, just let us know. The final thing we want to cover today is monitoring this data throughout the season. And there's a couple different ways you can do that. I'm going to start by clicking the summary icon on the navigation bar over on the left. And as we are now into the season, every day, any field that you've activated into live mode is going to run automatically using the weather data up through midnight of that morning. So this is the field that we just ran. And if you recall, we had a range of 160 to 230. I further modify that on my export, but the rec itself is still 160 to 230. The fact that this shows up in red on our dashboard indicates that it's calling for nitrogen in excess of the threshold that's set on the grower. And if I go into my grower list again by clicking Settings, User and Grower List, and then click the update next to any one of these growers, this is our nitrogen alert threshold. This is the value at which the dashboard is going to put that red banner and say this field needs nitrogen anytime one or more zones within that field exceeds that threshold for the current day. So I've got it set to 40, it's over 40, so it's going to trigger. You can set this to 0 if you want, and then you will be notified anytime there's a recommendation value at all. The second thing to point out on this page is you can see from here which system each of the fields are linked to. And in this case, I have one AgX field, and all the rest of my fields are not tied to a system. If you wanted to go and see the actual recommendations for the zones in that field, you can click the magnifying glass over on the right, and that's going to take you to the farm level dashboard, where you can see, in this case, there's only one active field, but if there were multiple, you'd see them all here. You can see the zone by zone recommendation. And if you recall earlier when we ran our recommendation, there was a tiny part of the field with no recommendation. Well, we can see why. There's something missing from a little part of our field, and I can go dig in and see what. Similarly, on that prior page, it showed us that it was 99% active, meaning there's a tiny little snippet of that field that's missing something. Whereas these two fields are 100% based on the check mark. So you can come in here on a daily basis, and as an agronomist or a billing admin, you will see all the fields that you have access to. As an admin, you can turn this on for your growers as well. And we ran an admin webinar that talks through that in detail. And we have a video available of that if you're interested. If you do give growers access, they will see this field level dashboard showing the summary and all the zones within those fields. And of course, they'll only see that for their own fields. Finally, now that we're into the season, we're running our N-Alert system. And if you click Settings and go to Change My Profile up at the top, you can turn on nitrogen alerts by checking these two boxes for yourself. You can set a start and an end date, basically when throughout the season you'd like to have this available. And then you can choose the days of the week down below that you'd like to receive your email and text message alerts. And finally, you can choose the level of detail that you'd like to see with each of the alerts that come for point and zone-based fields. You don't see an option for grid-based fields because there are so many grid cells, we're always going to summarize that data for you. Whereas for point and zone, if you turn these boxes on, it will show you zone by zone details instead of field level summaries. For those of you that haven't seen an alert yet, this is what it looks like on an iPhone. This is the email version. So it's basically going to show you the farm, field, the zone or the summary of the zones, the growth stage, and either the range or actual recommendation for each of those zones or fields, depending on how you have it set up. So feel free to give that a shot. You can set that up for yourself. You can set it up for your grower users, and you or your admin can adjust those thresholds as you like on a grower by grower basis. The final item that we're going to review is our input sensitivity document. I would encourage you to read through this at some point. As you know, there are a number of optional values within AdaptN, but this gives you a feel for how much of an impact they're going to make on a recommendation and in what circumstances. So, to give you just some highlights, expected yield is one of the most sensitive variables within the model. You don't want to underestimate this. You want to set a realistic yield expectation for that particular field. We don't want to look at county averages, perhaps unless you have zero information at all on the field. But we would really recommend you use the top yield that that field or perhaps a nearby similar field has received in the absence of other data in the last 5 seasons. When you get into the season, if you find that it's really a great season, maybe you want to bump that up. If you find that the season has other growth limiting factors, such as a drought, you may want to lower those yield goals. But this is an area you really want to give strong consideration to. On the flip side, the model is not very sensitive to planting rates, which is why you'll notice that we round them to various levels within the model. And that's indicated here by indication that an approximate value is fine. Just calling out some other important values. Organic matter is very important, so we really do recommend regular soil tests, ideally within the last 3 seasons, and ideally to a sample depth of 12 inches. If not, 6 inches is sufficient. And you can upload that again using a shapefile, or you can sync that data from the source systems. And then as you scroll down further on this document, there's a section at the bottom for observational values. This is things like crop emergence date, soil nitrate test results, and soil pH values. It really depends on the field and the situation as to how much of an impact these are going to have. So I would encourage you to read through this in our help documentation online and get a feel for whether it's going to have a big impact for your fields. In summary, fields that have fairly normal pH, where AdaptN is coming close to recommendations regarding PSNT values to what you're seeing in the field, there's not going to have much of an impact by making these changes. When there are extreme values, however, that's where you essentially are going to get the most impact from these modified recommendation parameters. Finally, I want to call your attention to that help site that I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of good information on there. And of course, if you're not aware of how to get a hold of us, the best way to reach us is by emailing support@adaptn.com. Especially for those of you that are working with advanced spatial data and really using a lot of these more advanced features, it's very helpful if you can point us to the grower farm field that you might have a question about, or ideally send us the URL of whatever screen you're on where you've got a question or if you're seeing an error. That'll allow us to respond to that most quickly. We would also love your feedback. And I would say that a lot of these advanced features and a lot of the things that are actually coming in the next few weeks and months are based on feedback from our more advanced users. So if there's a section of the application that you feel like can be optimized, or you have an idea for a way of making it easier to use or more powerful, we would love to hear that. We'd be happy to talk through it, and you'll see that we do take that feedback very seriously and try and incorporate those ideas whenever we can. So that's going to wrap up today's webinar. If you did not attend either our AdaptN Basic webinar, as I mentioned, you can see that video upon login. We also have a video available for admins that we'll be posting there for admins as well that goes through some of the more advanced administrative options. So I would encourage you to look at that. So we thank you very much for joining us today. We wish everyone the best and a successful season, and we look forward to working with you throughout the year. Have a good week. Take care.